This is a story about betrayal so deep it shattered a woman's world, about a love that refused to die, even when buried under lies, and about a little boy whose fragile heartbeat would force two broken souls back together in the most devastating way possible. Hello, my beautiful romance lovers. Welcome back to Stella's Love Tales. And wow, I am so thrilled you're here with me today. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below because I love seeing our global family grow. And speaking of family, have you hit that subscribe button yet? If you haven't, do it now because you're about to experience a romance so intense, so raw. Thorn Ripley's hands trembled as she stood outside the glass tower that pierced Seattle's gray November sky. The building where she'd once scrubbed floors on her knees, while her heart belonged to the man who owned every inch of it. The building where 5 years ago, security guards had gripped her arms and dragged her through the marble lobby, while employees whispered and pointed. The building she swore she'd never see again. Yet here she was, her son's medical file, clutched against her chest like a shield that couldn't protect her from what was coming. The rain soaked through her thin coat, the same coat she'd worn that horrible night when she begged him to believe her, when she'd screamed that the photos were lies, that she'd never betrayed him, that the baby growing inside her was his and only his. But Caspian Strathern had looked at her with those ice-blue eyes that once melted when they found her in empty hallways and said words that still woke her, gasping in the dark. "Get out of my sight. You're nothing but a liar and a whore." She'd loved him with a desperation that terrified her. This man who was 20 years older, this billionaire CEO who could have had any woman in the world but chose her, a maid who cleaned his penthouse office after midnight, who trembled the first time he'd touched her face and whispered that she was extraordinary, who'd believed him when he said their different worlds didn't matter, because what they had was rare and precious and worth fighting for, except he hadn't fought. He'd thrown her away the moment his mother showed him those doctored photographs of Thorne supposedly kissing his business rival in a hotel room. Photographs that were completely fabricated, but looked so real that even Thorne had stared at them in horror, wondering how someone could create such a perfect lie. Now 5-year-old Asher was dying, his small body ravaged by a rare blood disorder that was stealing him piece by piece. The doctors had said the words that brought her here. "He needs a bone marrow transplant from a biological parent. And you're not a match, which means we need to find his father." Thorne had spent 5 years building a life in Portland, working 3 jobs to keep Asher fed and warm, never telling him about the man whose eyes he'd inherited. Those same piercing blue eyes that could see straight through to your soul, never explaining why they lived in a tiny apartment instead of the mansion his father owned, never admitting that she'd been cast out like garbage because of lies she couldn't prove were false. But now her baby was dying, and pride meant nothing compared to his life. So she'd called Caspian's office and been told he'd see her at 2 o'clock, which gave her exactly 4 minutes to figure out how to face the man who'd destroyed her without falling apart. The lobby door slid open with a whisper, and the marble floors gleamed just like she remembered, except now she wore second-hand shoes instead of a maid's uniform. Now she walked through the front entrance instead of the service door. Now every eye turned to watch her, because somehow she looked different. Harder, maybe, or perhaps it was the desperation rolling off her in waves that made people stare. His assistant, the same cold blonde who'd smirked when security dragged Thorne out 5 years ago, looked up from her desk with recognition that turned quickly to shock, and Thorne felt a savage satisfaction at the woman's surprise. Because yes, she'd survived. Yes, she was still standing, and yes, she was about to walk back into Caspian Strathern's life, whether he wanted her there or not. "He's waiting," the assistant said, her voice tight, and Thorne wondered what Caspian had told his staff about her, wondered if they knew about the baby he'd rejected, wondered if anyone in this gleaming tower knew that their ruthless CEO had once whispered love words against her skin in the dark. She walked toward his office, each step an act of will, and pushed open the heavy door to find him standing at the window, his back to her, his shoulders broader than she remembered, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples now, and God help her. Even after everything, her traitorous body still responded to his presence, still remembered how those hands felt on her skin, still ached for what they'd lost. He turned slowly, and the impact of seeing his face again after 5 years nearly brought her to her knees. Those ice-blue eyes that haunted her dreams now fixed on her with an expression she couldn't read, and for one suspended moment neither of them spoke, the air between them crackling with history and hurt, and something darker, something that felt like hunger. "Thorn," he said, and his voice was exactly the same, deep and rough like whiskey and smoke. The voice that had once told her she was beautiful, that had gasped her name in pleasure, that had ordered her out of his life with brutal finality. And she hated that hearing it still affected her, still made her heart slam against her ribs like it was trying to escape. "Our son is dying," she said, because there was no other way to start this conversation. No gentle lead-in to the truth that would shatter whatever peace he'd found in the 5 years since he'd thrown her away, and she watched his face change, watched the color drain from his skin, watched his eyes go wide with shock that looked almost like fear. "What did you just say?" His voice was barely a whisper now, and Thorne pulled out the medical file, her hands steady, even though everything inside her was screaming, and said the words that would change everything. "His name is Asher. He's 5 years old. He has your eyes and your stubborn chin, and a blood disorder that's killing him. And I need you to save his life, even though you didn't believe mine was worth saving." She watched him process this, watched him do the math, watched the moment he realized that when he'd cast her out, she'd been carrying his child, and something that looked like anguish crossed his face before his expression hardened into the mask she remembered. The CEO mask that revealed nothing. "If this is some kind of—" he started, but she cut him off, her voice sharp as broken glass. "I have his birth certificate, his medical records, and a DNA test waiting at the hospital if you don't believe me, because I know you. Caspian, I know you'll need proof before you'll admit that you threw away your pregnant girlfriend based on lies your mother fed you." His jaw clenched at the mention of his mother, and Thorne felt a dark satisfaction, because yes, she'd gone there. Yes, she'd named the woman who'd orchestrated her destruction, and she could tell by the flash in his eyes that something about her words had hit home. "Why now?" he asked, and there was something raw in his voice. Something that sounded almost like pain, but Thorne was beyond caring about his feelings, beyond caring about anything except the little boy in a hospital bed who asked every night why he didn't have a daddy like other kids. "Because he's dying, and you're the only one who can save him. Because I've spent 5 years hating you, but I'd crawl through broken glass if it meant keeping my son alive. Because whether you believe it or not, Asher is yours, and he deserves a chance at life, even if his father is too blind to see the truth." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Thorne saw something shift in Caspian's expression, saw the exact moment his walls started to crack, and she knew with absolute certainty that everything was about to change, that walking through those doors had set something in motion that neither of them could stop. But what she didn't know, what terrified her more than anything, was whether the truth that was about to explode would save them, or destroy whatever fragile pieces of her heart had survived his betrayal. Drop a comment below and tell me, Should Thorn trust Caspian again? Or is she walking straight into another heartbreak? And don't forget to subscribe, because part 2 is going to reveal secrets that will blow your mind. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and fear, and Thorn sat beside Asher's bed watching her son sleep, his small chest rising and falling with breaths that seemed too fragile, too precious. And she thought about how 5 years ago she'd held him for the first time in a charity clinic with no one beside her. No hand to squeeze, no father to cut the umbilical cord. Just her and a baby who had his father's eyes and a future she had no idea how to build. She'd been 23 when she met Caspian, working night shifts at Strathern Industries because the pay was better than day cleaning, and because she'd been putting herself through community college, dreaming of becoming a teacher someday, never imagining that the CEO who worked late would notice her, would start conversations that turned into confessions, would make her believe that Cinderella stories could happen to girls like her who grew up in foster care with nothing but determination and hope. Her deepest fear had always been abandonment, the kind that came from being passed between 7 different homes before she aged out of the system at 18, the kind that made her believe she was fundamentally unlovable. And when Caspian had chosen her, despite their different worlds, she thought maybe, finally, someone saw her as worth keeping. Except his mother, Vivian Strathern, had seen something else entirely, had seen a threat to her son's empire and his carefully planned future with socialite Margot Tenenbaum, and had orchestrated Thorn's destruction with the precision of a woman who'd spent decades protecting her family's legacy at any cost. Asher stirred, his eyes fluttering open, those ice-blue eyes that were a daily reminder of the man who'd thrown them away, and he smiled at her with a sweetness that broke her heart every single time, because how could something so pure come from something so painful? "Mama, did you find him?" Asher asked, his voice small and hopeful, and Thorn's throat tightened because her son had been asking about his father for 2 years now, ever since he'd started kindergarten and noticed that other kids had daddies who picked them up and pushed them on swings. And she'd always deflected, always said, someday, never admitting that his father didn't know he existed, that his father had called her a liar and worse. "I found him, baby," she whispered, brushing his dark hair back from his forehead, and Asher's whole face lit up with a joy that terrified her. Because what if Caspian refused to help? What if he demanded that DNA test and then disappeared again? What if her son's hope became another abandonment that would mark him forever? "Is he nice? Does he want to meet me?" Asher's questions came rapid fire, and Thorn felt the weight of every lie she'd have to tell, every truth she'd have to hide. Because how could she explain to a 5-year-old that his father was complicated, that he was capable of great tenderness and brutal cruelty, that he'd loved her once but not enough to believe in her when it mattered most? The door opened, and Thorn's best friend Romy walked in carrying coffee, and the kind of fierce protectiveness that had sustained Thorn through her darkest moments. Romy, who'd been her roommate when she got pregnant, who'd held her while she sobbed after Caspian threw her out, who'd been in the delivery room when Asher was born and had whispered, "You're going to be an amazing mother," when Thorn was certain she'd fail at this too. "I saw him in the parking lot," Romy said, her voice tight with anger, and Thorn knew immediately she meant Caspian, knew that Romy had probably wanted to key his Mercedes or worse, because Romy didn't forgive easily, and she'd watched Thorn struggle for 5 years while Caspian lived in luxury. "He's coming up here, Thorn, and I swear to God, if he hurts you or that baby, I will destroy him, CEO or not." Romy's loyalty was absolute, the kind forged in shared poverty and late-night conversations about dreams that seemed impossible, and Thorn loved her for it even as she worried that Romy's protectiveness might make the situation more complicated. might reveal to Caspian just how much damage he'd done, how close Thorn had come to breaking completely. I need you to take Asher to the playroom, Thorn said quietly, because her son didn't need to witness whatever was about to happen, didn't need to see his mother face the man who'd rejected them both. And Romy nodded, understanding immediately, scooping Asher up with practiced ease and promising him hot chocolate and cartoons. Alone now, Thorn let herself feel the full weight of what was coming. Let herself remember not just the pain, but the love that had come before it. The way Caspian had made her feel seen for the first time in her life. The way he'd traced her face in the dark and told her she was extraordinary. The way he'd promised her a future that his mother had systematically destroyed. Her deepest desire had always been simple, almost embarrassingly so. She wanted to belong somewhere, to someone, to build the family she'd never had. And for 6 months with Caspian, she believed she'd found it, believed she was building something real and lasting, until Vivian had shown him those photographs, and everything had shattered like glass. The door opened again, and Caspian walked in, and Thorn saw immediately that something had changed in the 3 hours since she'd left his office. Saw it in the way he moved, in the tension around his eyes. In the manila folder he carried like it contained something explosive. "I had my investigators pull everything," he said without preamble, his voice rough, and Thorn's heart started hammering because what had he found? What had changed? Why did he look like a man who'd just discovered his entire world was built on lies? "The photographs. Thorn. The ones my mother showed me 5 years ago. My team traced them back to a digital manipulation expert she hired, and they found the original images. The real ones that show you were never in that hotel. That you were exactly where you said you were that night, working a double shift at the hospital cafeteria." His words hit her like physical blows. Validation she'd waited 5 years to hear. Proof that she'd been telling the truth all along. But instead of relief, she felt rage. White hot and consuming. Because he was telling her this now. After 5 years of struggling alone. After nights when she'd gone hungry so Asher could eat. After believing she was crazy for insisting the photographs were fake. "Your mother paid someone to destroy me," Thorn said, her voice shaking. And it wasn't a question because she'd always known Vivian was behind it. Had always known that woman saw her as nothing but a gold digger who needed to be eliminated. But having proof was different. Having proof meant Caspian knew he'd thrown away something real for a lie his mother had crafted. "She paid your co-worker, a woman named Iris, $50,000 to help stage those photos. And she paid the photographer another $100,000 to create the forgeries. And she did it all because she'd already arranged for me to marry Margot Tenenbaum, because our families had a merger planned, and you were threatening everything." Caspian's voice was hollow now, and Thorn saw something that looked like devastation in his eyes. But she couldn't let herself care about his pain, couldn't let herself forget that he'd believed his mother over her, that he'd chosen family loyalty over the woman carrying his child. "Does this change anything?" Thorn asked, and she hated how small her voice sounded, hated that part of her still wanted him to say yes, still wanted him to fight for them the way he should have 5 years ago. And she watched him struggle with the answer, watched him war with himself, and she realized with sudden clarity that Caspian Strathern was a man trapped between the empire he'd inherited and the life he'd thrown away, and she had no idea which side would win. "I want to meet him," Caspian said finally, and Thorn saw his hands were shaking, saw that beneath the CEO mask he was terrified, and she thought about all the ways this could go wrong, all the ways Asher could get hurt, all the ways she could lose her son to a man with unlimited resources, and a mother who'd already proven she'd do anything to protect her family's interests. "If you hurt him, if you reject him the way you rejected me, I will make sure you never see him again. DNA be damned, Thorne said. And she meant every word, meant it with a ferocity that surprised even her. Because she was a mother now, and that meant she was capable of things she'd never imagined, capable of fighting battles she'd once run from, and Caspian needed to understand that she wasn't the same frightened 23-year-old he'd thrown away. She was someone who'd survived his betrayal and come out stronger, someone who wouldn't break again, no matter what he did. Tell me in the comments, can Caspian ever make up for what he did? Or is some betrayal too deep to forgive? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget we're just getting started. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Asher meets his father for the first time. Thorne led Caspian down the sterile hospital corridor toward the playroom, her heart hammering so hard she thought he might hear it, and she wondered if he could sense her terror, her desperate hope, her absolute determination to protect Asher from any more pain. And when they reached the door with its cheerful cartoon stickers, she stopped and turned to face him, needing him to understand what was at stake before they walked through. "He doesn't know you rejected us," she said, her voice low and fierce. "He doesn't know you called me a liar and a whore. He doesn't know his father threw him away before he was even born. And if you can't look at him with love, if you can't pretend for 5 minutes that he matters to you, then turn around right now, because I won't let you break his heart the way you broke mine." Caspian's face went pale, and she saw something crack in his expression, something that looked like shame and regret, and a pain so deep it almost made her feel sorry for him. Almost. But then she remembered those security guards dragging her through the lobby, while he watched with cold eyes, and her sympathy evaporated like smoke. "I would never hurt him," Caspian said, and his voice was raw, stripped of the CEO authority, just a man facing the consequences of his worst mistake. And Thorne wanted to believe him, but belief was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when her son's fragile hope was on the line. So she just nodded and pushed open the door to find Asher building a tower of blocks with Romy, his small face scrunched in concentration, and the moment he looked up and saw them, his eyes went wide with an excitement that made Thorne's chest ache. "Is that him?" Asher whispered, and Thorne watched Caspian freeze, watched him stare at their son like he was seeing a ghost. And she realized he was cataloging every feature, every similarity, seeing his own face reflected in this small person he'd never known existed. And when Asher smiled, that heartbreaking smile that was pure joy and innocence, Caspian made a sound that was almost a sob. "Hi," Asher said, suddenly shy, and he walked toward Caspian with the careful steps of a child who'd been sick too long, who knew his body could betray him at any moment. And Thorne saw Caspian's hands clench like he wanted to reach out, but didn't know if he had the right. And she thought about all the moments he'd missed, all the firsts he'd never get back. The first smile, the first word, the first steps. 5 years of a life he'd thrown away because he believed a lie. "You have my eyes," Caspian said, and his voice was barely a whisper, and Asher nodded seriously, like this was very important information, and said, "Mama says I have your smart brain too, and your stubborn chin, but I don't know what stubborn means yet." The innocence of it, the absolute trust in Asher's voice, broke something in the room, broke something in Caspian's carefully constructed walls, and Thorne saw tears on his face, actual tears from a man she'd never seen cry, not even when he told her he loved her in the dark. Then everything exploded, because the door burst open, and Vivian Strathairn swept in like an avenging angel, her designer suit perfect, her silver hair immaculate, her face twisted with fury, and behind her was Margot Tenenbaum, the woman Caspian was supposed to have married, the woman who'd been his mother's choice all along. And Thorne felt ice flood her veins, because this was the woman from the fake photographs, the woman whose family merger had been more important than Thorne's life. What the hell is this? Vivian's voice was sharp as a blade, and she looked at Thorn with such hatred that Asher instinctively moved closer to his mother, sensing danger the way children do, and Thorn wrapped her arm around him, protective and fierce, ready to fight, even though she was outmatched in every way that mattered. "Mother, get out!" Caspian said, and there was something new in his voice, something Thorn had never heard before, a steel that suggested he was done being controlled, done letting his mother make his decisions. But Vivian just laughed, cold and cruel, and said, "I'm not going anywhere until this gold-digging whore explains why she's back after I paid her $100,000 to disappear." The words hung in the air like poison, and Thorn felt the world tilt. Because what was Vivian talking about? What $100,000? She'd never taken money. She left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby growing inside her. And then she saw Margot's face, saw the flash of panic there, saw the way the other woman's eyes darted to Vivian, and suddenly Thorn understood with crystal clarity that there was another layer to this betrayal, another secret that was about to detonate. "I never took your money," Thorn said, her voice steady, even though everything inside her was screaming, and Vivian's eyes narrowed, calculating, and she pulled out her phone. Pulled up a bank transfer, showed Caspian a transaction from 5 years ago, $100,000 paid to an account in Thorn's name, and Thorn watched Caspian's face change, watched doubt creep back in, watched him start to believe his mother's lies all over again. "I didn't open that account," Thorn said desperately, and she looked at Romy, at her best friend who'd been with her through everything, and saw Romy's face had gone white, saw something that looked like guilt, and Thorn's world shattered again, because no, not Romy, not the one person she'd trusted absolutely, but Romy was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face, and she said, "I didn't know, Thorn. I swear I didn't know. Iris asked me to open an account for you as a surprise. She said it was for a bonus from work. I thought I was helping you." Iris, the coworker who'd been paid to stage the photographs. Iris who'd been Romy's girlfriend at the time. Iris who'd manipulated everyone to serve Vivian's agenda. And Thorn felt rage and betrayal and a determination so fierce it burned through her fear. Because they'd all underestimated her, thought she'd break and run, thought she'd give up. But they didn't understand that she was a mother now, and mothers didn't break. They fought. "Get out," Thorn said to Vivian, to Margot, her voice deadly calm. "Get out, before I call security and tell them how you fabricated evidence, how you pay people to destroy an innocent woman, how you committed fraud and conspiracy, and then we'll see how your precious family legacy survives the scandal." She watched Vivian's face flush with anger. Watched the older woman realize she'd underestimated this maid she'd tried to destroy, and Thorn felt power surge through her because she wasn't powerless anymore. She had the truth, and she had proof, and she had a son worth fighting for. And when she looked at Caspian, she saw him staring at her like he'd never really seen her before, like he was finally understanding what he'd thrown away, and the heat in his eyes was attraction and respect, and something darker, something that looked like claiming. And Thorn knew with absolute certainty that everything had just changed, that the real battle was just beginning, and she was ready. Drop a comment and tell me, should Thorn forgive Romy, or is this betrayal too deep? And what do you think Caspian's going to do now that he knows the whole truth? Subscribe, because part 4 is going to be explosive. Caspian's penthouse overlooked Seattle like a kingdom, all glass and steel and cold perfection, and Thorn stood in the living room she'd once cleaned on her hands and knees, now holding Asher's hand, while their son stared wide-eyed at the floor-to-ceiling windows that showed the city glittering below like scattered diamonds. and she felt the weight of how much had changed in 72 hours. How Caspian had moved them from their tiny Portland apartment into his guest suite. How he'd hired the best pediatric oncologist in the country. How he'd looked at her this morning with heat in his eyes and said, "I'm not letting you go again." Like he had any right to make that decision. The bone marrow testing had confirmed what they already knew, that Caspian was a perfect match for Asher. That the transplant was scheduled for next week. That their son had a real chance at life now. But the relief Thorne felt was tangled with fear, because living in Caspian's world meant being close to him, meant watching him interact with Asher with a tenderness that made her chest ache, meant remembering how good they'd been together before everything fell apart. And she couldn't afford to fall for him again, couldn't risk her heart on a man who'd already shattered it once. "Mama, can I see my room again?" Asher asked, his voice bright with excitement, and Thorne nodded, watching him run down the hallway with more energy than he'd had in months. And she felt Caspian move closer behind her, felt the heat of his body, smelled his cologne that was exactly the same as 5 years ago. And her traitorous body responded with a hunger that terrified her. "We need to talk about Margot," Caspian said, and Thorne stiffened because she'd been avoiding this conversation, avoiding the reality that the woman from the fake photographs was still in Caspian's life, still had dinner with him twice a week, according to the society pages Thorne had tortured herself by reading. And she turned to face him, keeping her expression neutral even though jealousy was eating her alive. "There's nothing between us," Caspian continued, and he moved closer, crowding her against the window, his hand coming up to cup her face the way he used to, and Thorne's breath caught. Because she'd forgotten how he touched her, forgotten the way his fingers traced her cheekbone like she was something precious, and she hated that she wanted to lean into it, wanted to believe him. "Your mother wanted you to marry her," Thorne said, forcing herself to stay focused, to remember that attraction wasn't trust, that heat wasn't love. And Caspian's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening with something that looked like anger and frustration and desire all mixed together. "My mother wanted a lot of things that I'm done giving her," he said, and his thumb brushed her lower lip, and Thorne felt electricity shoot through her body, felt herself sway toward him, before she caught herself and stepped back, putting distance between them because she couldn't think when he was touching her, couldn't remember all the reasons this was dangerous. The doorbell rang, shattering the moment, and Thorne felt relief and disappointment in equal measure. And when Caspian opened the door, Romy stood there looking smaller than Thorne had ever seen her, her eyes red from crying, her hands twisting together nervously, and Thorne felt her anger war with love. Because Romy had been manipulated too, had been used by Iris just like Thorne had been used. But the betrayal still stung, still felt like another person she'd trusted had let her down. "I brought all the documentation," Romy said quietly, holding out a folder. "Everything Iris ever gave me, every text message, every email. I went through 5 years of records, and I found proof that she was working with Vivian the whole time, that she used me to get close to you, that everything about our relationship was a lie." Thorne saw the devastation in her friend's face, understood that Romy had lost something too, had discovered that the woman she'd loved had been a plant, a spy sent to gather information and create opportunities for Vivian's schemes. And Thorne's anger softened because they were both victims here, both women who'd been manipulated by people with more power and fewer scruples. "I'm so sorry," Romy whispered, and Thorne pulled her into a hug, felt her friend shake with sobs, and she thought about how Vivian had destroyed so many lives with her machinations, how the woman's need for control had created ripples of pain that touched everyone, and Thorne's determination to fight back crystallized into something sharp and focused. Caspian took the folder, his expression grim as he flipped through the evidence. And Thorn watched him see the full scope of his mother's betrayal. Watched him realize that Vivian hadn't just destroyed his relationship with Thorn, she'd orchestrated an entire conspiracy that involved multiple people and lasted years. And when he looked up, his eyes were cold with a fury that reminded Thorn why people feared him in boardrooms. "She's going to pay for this," Caspian said, and his voice was deadly calm, the voice of a man who'd built an empire and knew exactly how to dismantle his enemies. But Thorn shook her head because revenge wasn't what mattered. Asher was what mattered, and getting caught up in a war with Vivian would only hurt their son. "I don't want revenge," Thorn said. "I want you to choose, Caspian. I want you to decide right now whether you're going to stand with us or with your mother, because I won't put Asher through a custody battle. I won't let him grow up in the middle of your family drama, and if you can't cut ties with Vivian completely, then we're leaving the moment he's recovered from the transplant." She watched her ultimatum land, watched Caspian struggle with what she was asking, and she knew it wasn't fair, knew she was forcing him to choose between his mother and his son. But life wasn't fair, and she'd learned that lesson the hard way. And she needed to know that he was capable of putting Asher first, of being the father their son deserved. "You're asking me to destroy my family," Caspian said, and there was anguish in his voice. But Thorn felt no sympathy because he'd destroyed hers 5 years ago, had thrown her out without a second thought. And now he was learning what it felt like to have impossible choices. To lose something precious because of someone else's actions. "I'm asking you to build a new family," Thorn said, and she moved closer to him, let him see the determination in her eyes, the absolute certainty that she would walk away if he couldn't meet her terms. And she watched something shift in his expression, watched him realize that she wasn't the same woman he'd thrown away, that she'd grown steel in her spine and fire in her heart. And the way he looked at her changed, became something heated and possessive and almost desperate. "I choose you," Caspian said, and he pulled her against him, his hand tangling in her hair. And Thorn felt her body respond even as her mind screamed warnings. Felt herself soften against him, even though she knew this was dangerous, knew that letting him back in meant risking everything all over again. But then Asher called out, "Mama, come see!" And the moment shattered, reality crashing back in, and Thorn pulled away, her heart hammering, wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or if maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at something real this time. Tell me in the comments, is Caspian's choice enough? Or does Thorn need more proof before she can trust him? And what do you think Vivian's going to do when she finds out she's losing control? Subscribe because part 5 is going to change everything. The transplant surgery was scheduled for dawn, and Thorn sat in Asher's hospital room, watching her son sleep, memorizing every detail of his face. Because even though the doctor said the procedure was safe, even though Caspian's bone marrow was a perfect match, she couldn't shake the terror that something would go wrong, that she'd lose the only person who'd ever been truly hers. And when Caspian walked in at 3 a.m. carrying coffee, she didn't have the energy to pretend she was okay, didn't have the strength to keep her walls up. And when he pulled her into his arms, she let herself break, let herself sob against his chest while he held her and whispered promises she desperately wanted to believe. "I can't lose him," Thorn said, her voice raw, and Caspian's arms tightened around her, and she felt his lips press against her hair, felt the tremor in his body that told her he was terrified too, that despite all his money and power, he was just as helpless as she was in the face of their son's illness. And somehow that shared vulnerability cracked something open between them. Something that had been locked tight since the moment he'd thrown her out 5 years ago. "You won't," Caspian said, and he tilted her face up, his thumb wiping away her tears. And the way he looked at her was different now, stripped of pretense and pride, just raw emotion and a hunger that made her breath catch. And when he kissed her, it wasn't gentle. It was desperate and claiming, and full of 5 years of regret. And Thorn kissed him back with equal ferocity, pouring all her fear and anger and impossible hope into it. And for one perfect moment, nothing else existed except the two of them and the connection that had never really died, despite everything that had tried to kill it. Then Caspian's phone buzzed, shattering the moment, and he pulled back with a curse. And Thorn saw his face go pale as he read whatever message had just come through. Saw shock and fury, and something that looked like devastation flash across his features. And her stomach dropped because she just knew, that whatever he'd just learned was going to change everything. "What is it?" Thorn asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. And Caspian looked at her with eyes that held too much pain, too much guilt, and he said, "Margot just sent me proof that my mother didn't just fabricate the photographs 5 years ago. She fabricated the DNA test too." The words didn't make sense at first, hung in the air like a riddle Thorn couldn't solve. And she stared at Caspian, trying to understand what he was telling her. What DNA test? And then it hit her with the force of a physical blow. Because there had been a DNA test, Vivian had insisted on one when Thorn first told Caspian she was pregnant, had demanded proof before she'd allow her son to acknowledge the child, and the test had come back negative, had shown that Caspian wasn't the father, and that result had been the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. The proof that convinced Caspian his mother was right about Thorn being a liar and a cheat. "She paid the lab," Caspian continued, and his voice was hollow, dead, like something fundamental had broken inside him. "She paid them $200,000 to falsify the results, to show that I wasn't the father when I was. And I believed it, Thorn. I looked at you and I believed you cheated on me. I threw you out while you were carrying my child because I trusted my mother more than I trusted you. And I've spent 5 years thinking I dodged a bullet when really I destroyed everything that mattered." Thorn felt the room spin, felt 5 years of pain and struggle and loneliness crash over her like a wave, because he'd had proof. He'd had scientific evidence that she was lying, and she'd never blamed him for believing it, because how could she? How could she expect him to trust her word over laboratory results? But now she knew that even that had been a lie, that Vivian's manipulation had gone deeper than anyone imagined, that the woman had been willing to deny her own grandchild to maintain control over her son. "Margot sent you this?" Thorn asked, because that didn't make sense. Why would Caspian's almost fiancée expose Vivian's crimes? Why would she help them? And Caspian nodded, his jaw clenched, and he showed Thorn his phone, showed her a long message from Margot, explaining that she'd been in love with someone else for years, that she'd only agreed to the arranged marriage because her family's company was bankrupt and needed the Strathern merger, that she'd been Vivian's prisoner too in her own way. And now that she'd finally found the courage to walk away, she wanted to burn down all of Vivian's lies, wanted to free everyone the woman had manipulated and controlled. "There's more," Caspian said, and Thorn saw his hands were shaking, saw that whatever else Margot had revealed was somehow worse than everything that had come before, and she braced herself, wrapped her arms around her middle like she could hold herself together through sheer force of will. "My mother knew Asher was sick," Caspian said, and his voice broke on their son's name. "Margot found emails between my mother and a private investigator she'd hired to track you. Emails from 6 months ago when Asher was first diagnosed, and my mother knew he needed a bone marrow transplant, knew I was probably the only match, and she did nothing. She let him suffer because she was more concerned about protecting me from you than saving her own grandson's life. The revelation was so monstrous, so incomprehensibly cruel, that Thorn couldn't process it, couldn't understand how anyone could let a child die to maintain a lie. And she looked at Caspian and saw that he couldn't understand it either, saw that this had shattered something fundamental in him, had destroyed whatever remained of his relationship with his mother, and she knew that Vivian had finally gone too far, had finally committed an act so unforgivable that even her son couldn't rationalize it away. "I'm going to destroy her," Caspian said, and there was no heat in his voice, just cold certainty, the voice of a man who'd made an irrevocable decision. "I'm going to remove her from the company. I'm going to expose every illegal thing she's ever done. I'm going to make sure she never has power over anyone ever again. And I don't care if it costs me everything. I don't care if it destroys the Strathern name, because she tried to kill our son, and that's something I can never forgive." Thorn saw the man she'd fallen in love with 5 years ago, saw the person he'd been before his mother's poison had twisted him, and she realized that this revelation had freed him in a way nothing else could have, had cut the last tie that bound him to Vivian's manipulation. And when he looked at her now, there was nothing between them anymore. No doubts, no lies, just the raw truth of what they'd lost and what they might still save. "After the transplant," Thorn said, because Asher was still the priority, still the only thing that mattered. "After our son is safe, then we deal with your mother. Then we make her pay for everything she's done. But right now, I need you to focus on Asher. I need you to be strong for him because he's about to go through the hardest thing he's ever faced, and he needs both his parents." She watched Caspian nod, watched him pull himself together with visible effort. And when he reached for her hand, she took it, laced her fingers through his, and felt something shift between them, something that felt like partnership and trust, and the beginning of forgiveness. And she knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Drop a comment. Can you believe Vivian let Asher suffer for 6 months? What should Caspian do to her? And do you think Thorn can ever fully trust him again after everything? Subscribe, because part 6 is going to be intense. The transplant had gone perfectly, the doctors said, Caspian's bone marrow flowing into Asher's small body like liquid hope. And for 48 hours, Thorn had allowed herself to believe that the worst was over, that they'd won, that her son would finally be healthy. But then Asher's fever spiked to 104, and his body started rejecting the transplant. And suddenly the doctors were using words like graft versus host disease, and critical condition, and prepare yourself. And Thorn felt her world collapse, because she'd survived poverty and betrayal and 5 years of struggling alone. But she couldn't survive losing Asher, couldn't exist in a world where her son didn't. She stood outside the ICU, watching through the glass, as nurses swarmed around Asher's bed, watching machines beep frantically, watching her baby's small body convulse. And she felt Caspian beside her, felt him shaking with the same terror that was ripping her apart. And when he tried to hold her, she pushed him away because this was his fault somehow. His genetics that were attacking their son. His bone marrow that was supposed to save Asher but was killing him instead. And she knew she was being irrational, but she needed someone to blame, needed somewhere to direct the rage and helplessness that was consuming her. "This is because of your mother," Thorn said, and her voice was vicious, cruel, looking for any target to hurt the way she was hurting. "If she hadn't kept us apart, if she hadn't let Asher get this sick, if we'd done the transplant 6 months ago when he was stronger, maybe his body could have handled it. Maybe he wouldn't be dying right now because your family is poison, Caspian. Everything you touch turns toxic, and I should have stayed away. Should have let him die in peace, rather than put him through this torture." She watched her words land like physical blows, watched Caspian's face crumble, and she felt savage satisfaction mixed with immediate regret, because she didn't mean it, didn't blame him. But the pain had to go somewhere, and he was there, and she was drowning in fear and needed to lash out at something, anything, to keep from falling apart completely. "Get away from me," Thorne continued, her voice breaking. "Get away from us. You've done enough damage. Your bone marrow is killing him, and I can't look at you right now. I can't stand here and watch you pretend to care when this is all your fault for believing your mother over me, for throwing me out, for wasting 5 years we could have spent together, for making every single wrong choice at every single turn." She saw Caspian reach for her, and she backed away, pressed herself against the glass separating her from Asher, and she wanted to scream, wanted to break something, wanted to rewind time and make different choices, better choices, choices that didn't lead to this moment where her son was dying and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Caspian's phone rang, shrill and intrusive, and he answered it with shaking hands. And Thorne watched his face go from devastated to shocked to absolutely murderous. And when he hung up, he looked at her with eyes that held a new kind of pain, a fresh betrayal that somehow cut through even the nightmare of Asher's crisis. "That was my lawyer," Caspian said, his voice hollow. "My mother just filed for emergency custody of Asher. She's claiming that we're unfit parents, that our unstable relationship is detrimental to his care. And she's got 3 doctors who've signed affidavits saying that the transplant rejection is due to parental stress and conflict. And the judge is someone she's donated millions to over the years. And there's a hearing tomorrow morning. And if she wins, she's going to take him away from both of us the moment he's stable enough to move." The words were so absurd, so impossibly cruel, that Thorne almost laughed, because how could things get worse? How could Vivian still be finding ways to destroy them when their son was fighting for his life? But then she understood that this was exactly when Vivian would strike, when they were weakest, when they were too broken to fight back effectively. And the woman's calculated evil took Thorne's breath away. "She can't do that," Thorne said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were meaningless because Vivian could do anything, had already proven she was willing to commit fraud and conspiracy and let a child suffer, and a custody battle was nothing compared to the crimes she'd already committed. And Thorne felt despair crash over her like a wave, because even if Asher survived the rejection, even if his body accepted the transplant, Vivian was going to take him away, was going to use her money and power and connections to steal their son, and there was nothing they could do to stop her. "I have to go," Caspian said, and Thorne heard the defeat in his voice, heard that he'd already given up. "I have to meet with my lawyers, have to try to build a defense, have to figure out how to fight this, and I know you don't want me here anyway. I know you blame me, and you're right too. This is my fault, all of it, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to save him." He moved toward the elevator, and Thorne watched him go, watched the man she just started to trust again walk away, and she wanted to call him back, wanted to apologize for the cruel things she'd said, wanted to tell him they needed to face this together. But the words stuck in her throat because she was drowning in fear and couldn't think beyond the next breath, couldn't see past the image of Asher's small body fighting a battle he was losing. Romy appeared beside her, pressed a coffee into her hands that Thorne couldn't drink, and her friend's face was streaked with tears. And Thorne realized that Romy loved Asher too, had been there for every milestone, every doctor's appointment, every middle-of-the-night fever, and this loss would devastate her too if the worst happened. "The nurses say his vitals are stabilizing," Romy whispered. But Thorne could hear the doubt in her voice, could see that her friend was trying to offer hope she didn't really feel. And Thorne nodded numbly, unable to speak, unable to process anything beyond the terror that was eating her alive. Then her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and when she opened it, she saw a message from Margot. Vivian just offered me $5 million to testify against you in the custody hearing, to say I witnessed you and Caspian fighting violently in front of Asher, to say I have concerns about your mental stability. And I wanted you to know that she's building a case with bought testimony and fabricated evidence. And I'm so sorry, but I don't know how to help you fight someone with unlimited resources and no conscience. Thorne read the message 3 times, felt each word like a nail in a coffin, and she understood with crystal clarity that Vivian was going to win, that even if Asher survived, she was going to lose him anyway, that all her fighting and struggling and surviving had been for nothing, because in the end, money and power always won, and she was just a maid who'd dared to love above her station and was about to pay the ultimate price. She slid down the wall outside the ECU, pulled her knees to her chest, and let herself break completely. Let the sobs tear through her body while Romy held her and whispered meaningless comfort. And Thorne thought about running, about grabbing Asher the moment he was stable and disappearing, about taking him somewhere Vivian could never find them. But she knew that was fantasy, knew that Vivian's reach was too long, her resources too vast, and there was nowhere Thorne could hide that the woman wouldn't eventually find them. Inside the ICU, Asher's monitors continued their frantic beeping, and Thorne pressed her hand against the glass, separated from her son by barriers she couldn't cross, watching him fight a battle she couldn't help him win. And she'd never felt more powerless, more defeated, more absolutely certain that she was about to lose everything that mattered. And the darkness was so complete, so suffocating, that she couldn't see any way out, couldn't imagine any future where they survived this. And for the first time since she'd discovered she was pregnant 5 years ago, Thorne felt her hope die, felt the fight drain out of her, felt herself surrender to the inevitable destruction that Vivian Strathern had orchestrated with such meticulous, monstrous precision. Tell me in the comments, how can Thorne possibly fight back against Vivian's power? Do you think Asher will survive? And can Thorne and Caspian find their way back to each other after everything that's happened? Subscribe because part 7 is going to bring the fight back. Thorne woke to find Caspian sitting beside her in the hospital waiting room, his suit rumpled, his eyes bloodshot, and when she met his gaze, she saw something that made her breath catch because the defeat was gone, replaced by a fierce determination that reminded her why he'd built an empire before he was 30, why people feared him in boardrooms, why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Asher's fever broke, Caspian said, and his voice was rough with exhaustion and relief. The doctors say the rejection is reversing. His body is accepting the transplant. He's going to make it, Thorne. Our son is going to live. She felt the words wash over her like a benediction, felt 5 days of terror release its grip on her chest, and when Caspian pulled her into his arms, she didn't push him away this time, just held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had been spinning out of control. And she felt his tears against her neck, felt his body shake with the same overwhelming relief that was flooding through her. And for the first time since the transplant, she let herself believe that maybe they hadn't lost everything. Maybe there was still hope. "I'm sorry," Thorne whispered, because the cruel things she'd said haunted her, the blame she'd thrown at him when he was suffering just as much as she was. And Caspian shook his head, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You had every right to be angry," he said. "Every right to blame me. Because you're right. If I'd trusted you 5 years ago, if I'd fought for you instead of believing my mother, none of this would have happened. Asher would have grown up with both his parents. He would have been diagnosed earlier, treated earlier, and I have to live with that. have to live with knowing that my cowardice almost cost us everything. She saw the guilt eating him alive, saw that he was punishing himself far more harshly than she ever could, and she realized that they were both victims of Vivian's manipulation. Both people who'd made choices based on lies and fabricated evidence, and holding on to anger wasn't going to change the past, wasn't going to help them fight for their future. We can't change what happened, Thorne said, and she pressed her forehead against his, breathed him in, let herself feel the connection that had never really broken, despite everything that had tried to destroy it. But we can make sure Vivian never hurts anyone again. We can fight her together. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's how we move forward. She felt Caspian's arms tighten around her, felt him nod against her, and when he pulled back to look at her, his eyes held something that made her heart stutter because it was love, raw and unguarded, and absolutely certain. The kind of love she'd thought was dead, but had just been buried under layers of pain and betrayal. "I have a plan," Caspian said, and his voice took on the edge she recognized from business calls she'd overheard when they were together. The tone that meant he was about to do something ruthless and brilliant. "Margot sent me everything. Every illegal transaction my mother has made in the last 20 years. Every bribe, every falsified document, every law she's broken to maintain her power. And it's enough to destroy her, enough to send her to prison. But I need you to trust me. Need you to let me handle the custody hearing while you stay with Asher. Because I'm going to walk into that courtroom and I'm going to burn down everything my mother has built. And when I'm done, she won't have the power to threaten anyone ever again." Thorne saw the plan forming in his eyes, saw the calculated fury that came from a man who'd finally found something worth fighting for, and she realized that this was the moment. This was when they either trusted each other completely or lost everything. And she thought about all the times she'd been let down, all the times she'd trusted and been betrayed, but she also thought about how Caspian had looked at Asher with such tenderness, how he'd held her while she broke, how he'd chosen them over his mother without hesitation, and she made a choice, made a leap of faith that terrified her, but felt right in a way nothing else had in 5 years. "What do you need from me?" Thorne asked, and she watched relief and love flash across Caspian's face. Watched him realize that she was giving him her trust, her partnership, her faith that he wouldn't let them down this time. "I need you to write down everything," Caspian said, pulling out his phone. "Everything my mother did to you 5 years ago. Every threat, every manipulation, every moment of cruelty. Because Margot found the coworker who planted the fake evidence, found Iris, and they're both willing to testify in exchange for immunity. And with your testimony and theirs, and the falsified DNA test, and the proof that my mother knew Asher was sick and did nothing, we can prove she's unfit, we can prove she's dangerous, and we can make sure she never gets near our son again." Thorne felt something shift inside her, felt the powerlessness that had defined the last 5 days transform into determination, into fury, into the absolute certainty that she was done being Vivian's victim, done letting the woman control her life. And she grabbed Caspian's phone and started typing, her fingers flying across the screen as she documented every horrible moment, every threat, every time Vivian had made her feel small and worthless and disposable. "There's something else," Caspian said, and his voice softened, became vulnerable in a way she'd never heard before. "After this is over, after my mother is dealt with and Asher is healthy, I want us to be a family, a real family, and I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I destroyed your trust, but I love you, Thorne. I've loved you since the moment you told me my coffee order was pretentious, and I should try something with actual flavor. And I spent 5 years trying to convince myself I was better off without you, when really I was just half alive, just going through the motions. And I don't want to waste another day. Don't want to miss another moment of watching our son grow up or holding you or building the life we should have had all along. She looked up from the phone, looked at this man who'd broken her heart, and was now offering it back with both hands. And she saw the truth in his eyes, saw that he meant every word. And she thought about all the romance novels she'd read, where the heroine forgave too easily, where love conquered all without real work or change. But this wasn't a novel, this was her life. And Caspian had proven himself through actions, not words, had chosen her over his mother, had fought for their son, had shown her the man he could be when he wasn't poisoned by Vivian's manipulation. Ask me again, after we win, Thorne said. And she saw hope flare in Caspian's eyes, saw him understand that she wasn't saying no, just not yet, that she needed to see him follow through, needed to watch him destroy his mother's power before she could fully trust him with her heart again. And he nodded, pulled her close, kissed her forehead with a tenderness that made her ache. I'll win, Caspian promised. I'll walk into that courtroom and I'll dismantle everything she's built. And when I'm done, the only power she'll have is whatever she can exercise from a prison cell. And then I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm worth the risk, that we're worth fighting for, that our family is the only thing that matters. Thorne felt his words settle into her bones, felt them kindle something that had been dormant for 5 years. And when a nurse appeared to tell them Asher was awake and asking for his parents, they walked into that hospital room together, hand in hand, united in a way they'd never been before. And Thorne looked at her son's smile, at Caspian's tears of joy, at the family they were building from the ashes of Vivian's destruction. And she felt hope bloom in her chest, fierce and bright, and absolutely unshakable, because they'd survived the darkest hour and come out stronger, and now nothing could stop them from claiming the future they deserved. Comment below. Do you think Caspian can really take down Vivian? What do you want to see happen to her in court? And are you ready for Thorne and Caspian's happily ever after? Subscribe because Part 8 is going to be everything. The courtroom was packed with reporters because somehow word had leaked that the Strathern family was imploding. And Thorne sat in the front row watching Vivian enter with her team of lawyers, watching the woman's face radiate confidence and entitlement. And Thorne felt her stomach clench, because Vivian looked like someone who'd already won, like someone who knew the judge was bought, and the outcome predetermined. But then Caspian walked in, and the energy in the room shifted because he wasn't alone. He had Margot beside him, and Iris, the former maid, and the co-worker who'd planted the fake photographs. And he had boxes of evidence that his team wheeled in on carts. And Thorne saw Vivian's confidence flicker for just a moment before her mask slammed back into place. The judge called the hearing to order, and Vivian's lawyer stood up with a practiced smile, began painting a picture of Thorne as an unstable gold digger who'd trapped Caspian with a pregnancy, who'd kept his son from him out of spite, who'd created a toxic environment that was detrimental to Asher's health. And Thorne felt each word like a slap, felt the old shame trying to resurface. But then she looked at Caspian and saw him watching her with such absolute faith, such unwavering support, that she sat up straighter, lifted her chin, refused to let Vivian's lies make her feel small ever again. Mrs. Strathern is concerned for her grandson's welfare, the lawyer continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. She simply wants to provide stability and proper care that these two clearly cannot offer, given their volatile relationship and questionable judgment. And Thorne saw several reporters nodding, saw the judge's expression remain neutral but not hostile. and she felt panic start to rise because maybe Caspian's evidence wouldn't be enough. Maybe Vivian's money and connections would win after all. Then Caspian stood up, and the courtroom went silent, and when he spoke his voice was cold and precise, the voice of a man who'd built an empire and was about to use every weapon in his arsenal to protect what mattered. Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence that my mother, Vivian Strathearn, has committed multiple felonies in her campaign to destroy my relationship with Miss Thorne Alden and deny my son proper medical care, Caspian said, and he nodded to his lawyer, who began distributing documents. And Thorne watched Vivian's face go pale, watched her lean over to whisper frantically to her legal team. Exhibit A is proof that my mother paid Westbridge Laboratory $200,000 to falsify a paternity test 5 years ago. Caspian continued, his voice never wavering. The test showed I wasn't Asher's father, when in fact I am, and this falsified result was used to convince me that Ms. Alden had been unfaithful, leading directly to our separation and my son growing up without his father. And he projected the bank records on the screen, showed the payment trail, showed the lab director's signed confession that Margot had obtained, and Thorne heard gasps ripple through the courtroom, heard reporters' fingers flying across their phones. Exhibit B shows that my mother hired someone to plant fake photographs suggesting Ms. Alden was having an affair, Caspian said, and Iris stood up, her hands shaking but her voice clear, and she testified about how Vivian had paid her $10,000 to stage compromising photos, how she'd been threatened into silence, how she'd lived with the guilt for 5 years. And Thorne saw the judge's expression shift from neutral to disturbed, saw that the evidence was landing exactly as Caspian had planned. Exhibit C is perhaps the most damning, Caspian said, and his voice finally cracked with emotion, with fury barely contained. These are emails between my mother and a private investigator showing that she knew my son was diagnosed with leukemia 6 months ago, knew he needed a bone marrow transplant, knew I was likely the only match, and she deliberately withheld this information, deliberately let my son suffer because she was more concerned with keeping me away from Ms. Alden than saving her own grandson's life. And the courtroom erupted, reporters shouting questions, the judge banging his gavel, and Thorne saw Vivian's mask finally shatter, saw raw panic in the woman's eyes as she realized her carefully constructed lies were collapsing around her. Margot stood next, elegant and composed, and she testified about Vivian's attempt to bribe her, about the years of manipulation and control, about how the Strathearn matriarch had built her power through fraud and intimidation and systematic destruction of anyone who threatened her authority. And with each word, Thorne felt the weight she'd carried for 5 years lift, felt vindication and justice, and the sweet satisfaction of watching her tormentor finally face consequences. Your Honor, I'm not here asking you to grant me custody, Caspian said, and his voice softened as he looked at Thorne. I'm here asking you to deny my mother's petition and recognize that she is a danger to my son, that she has proven herself willing to commit crimes and let a child suffer to maintain control, and that the only people who should have custody of Asher Alden are his parents, who love him more than anything in this world and have fought through hell to save him. The judge looked at Vivian, and his expression was thunderous, and he said, Mrs. Strathearn, I'm denying your petition for custody. I'm referring this evidence to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. And I'm issuing a restraining order preventing you from coming within 500 feet of the child or his parents. And I want to say for the record that in 30 years on the bench, I have never seen such a calculated and cruel abuse of power, such a willingness to harm an innocent child for personal gain. And I hope you spend a very long time in prison thinking about what you've done. Thorne watched Vivian's face crumble, Watch the woman who'd terrorized her for 5 years be led away by bailiffs, while reporters swarmed and cameras flashed. And she felt Caspian's hand find hers, felt him pull her close, and when she looked up at him, she saw tears streaming down his face, saw relief and love and absolute devotion. And he whispered, "It's over. She can never hurt us again. We're free." They walked out of that courtroom into blinding sunlight and a mob of reporters, but Caspian shielded her, got her into his car, and they drove straight to the hospital where Asher was waiting, where their son was sitting up in bed looking healthier than he had in months. And when they walked in together, Asher's face lit up with pure joy, and he said, "Mommy, Daddy, did we win?" And Thorne felt her heart overflow because he'd called Caspian Daddy, because her son finally had both his parents, because they'd survived everything Vivian had thrown at them and come out stronger. And she said, "Yes, baby, we won. We won everything." Drop a comment. How did that courtroom takedown feel? Did Vivian get what she deserved? And are you ready for the final part where Thorne and Caspian get their happily ever after? Subscribe because part 9 is going to melt your heart. 3 months later, Thorne stood in the penthouse that had once felt like a prison, but now felt like home, watching Asher chase Bubbles across the living room while his laughter filled every corner with pure joy. And the doctors had declared him in complete remission, his body strong and healthy, and finally free from the disease that had stolen so much of his childhood. Caspian came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and she leaned back against him, let herself sink into the safety and love she'd once thought was lost forever. And when she looked at the diamond ring on her finger, she still couldn't quite believe this was real, that she'd gone from scrubbing floors to becoming Mrs. Caspian Strathern, that the fairy tale she'd stopped believing in had somehow come true. "What are you thinking about?" Caspian murmured against her neck, and Thorne smiled, because she was thinking about how far they'd come, how they'd taken the broken pieces of their past and built something beautiful, how Vivian's 15-year prison sentence had freed them to create the family they'd always deserved. And she turned in his arms, kissed him with all the love and gratitude and absolute certainty that this man was her forever. "I'm thinking about how you asked me to marry you in a hospital cafeteria while I was eating terrible jello," Thorne said, and Caspian laughed, that deep rumbling sound that still made her heart skip. "And how I said yes before you even finished the question because I'd already wasted 5 years and I wasn't going to waste another second." And she saw his eyes go soft with emotion, saw him look at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. And she knew with absolute certainty that she was loved, cherished, protected in ways she'd never imagined possible. Asher ran over and crashed into their legs, his small arms wrapping around both of them. And he looked up with those eyes that were pure Caspian and said, "Can we have pancakes for dinner? And can we watch that movie about the dragons? And can Romy come over because I miss her?" And Thorne felt her heart swell because her son was healthy and happy and surrounded by people who loved him. And Romy had become Asher's honorary aunt, had moved into the guest house on their property, had finally started her own catering business with Caspian's investment, and was thriving in ways that made Thorne so proud. "Pancakes and dragons and Romy sounds perfect," Caspian said, scooping Asher up and spinning him until he shrieked with delight. And Thorne watched them together, watched the bond between father and son grow stronger every day. And she thought about how Caspian had sold his mother's company, donated half the proceeds to children's cancer research, and restructured his entire life around family, around being present, around never missing another moment. They'd started a foundation in Asher's name that helped single mothers afford medical care for their children, and Thorn ran it with a passion that came from knowing exactly what it felt like to be desperate and alone and terrified. And she'd helped dozens of families already, had turned her pain into purpose, had transformed her story from tragedy into triumph. Later that night, after Asher was asleep and Romy had gone home and the penthouse was quiet, Caspian pulled Thorn onto the balcony where the city lights sparkled below them like fallen stars, and he said, "I have something for you." And he handed her a leather journal, and when she opened it, she saw pages filled with his handwriting, saw that he'd written down every moment he'd missed from Asher's first 5 years, based on stories she'd told him, every first word and first step and first day of school. And he'd added his own thoughts, his regrets, his promises to never miss another milestone. And Thorn felt tears stream down her face, because this man understood her, knew that those lost years still hurt, and he was trying to honor them, trying to show her that, even though he couldn't change the past, he would spend forever making up for it. "I love you," Thorn whispered, and the words felt inadequate for the depth of emotion she felt, for the gratitude and passion and absolute devotion that consumed her. "I love you and Asher and this life we've built, and I'm so glad I didn't give up, so glad I kept fighting, because this right here, this moment, this family, this is everything I ever wanted, and more than I ever dreamed possible." Caspian kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise. And when he pulled back, he said, "This is just the beginning. We have forever ahead of us. Forever to love each other, to raise our son, to build more memories. And I promise you that every single day I will choose you. Choose us. Choose this family over everything else in the world." And Thorn believed him, trusted him, knew that they'd been tested by fire and come out stronger. And their love was the kind that could survive anything because it already had. She looked out at the city, where she'd once felt so small and powerless, where she'd scrubbed floors and counted pennies and wondered if she'd ever be enough. And she realized that she'd always been enough, had always been worthy of love and respect and happiness, and Vivian's cruelty hadn't diminished her, had only revealed her strength, and she was proud of the woman she'd become, proud of the mother she was, proud of the life she'd fought so hard to claim. "Come on," Caspian said, pulling her toward the bedroom with a wicked smile that made her laugh. "Let's go make some more memories." And Thorn followed him, her heart full, her future bright, her soul finally at peace, because she'd survived the storm and found her happily ever after, and nothing in this world could take that away from her now. And that's how you fight for your happily ever after. If this story touched your heart, if you felt every emotion right alongside Thorn and Caspian, then smash that subscribe button, because Stella's got so many more passionate, heart-pounding romance tales coming your way. Drop a comment telling me, what was your favorite moment from this story? Was it the courtroom takedown, the hospital reunion, that proposal in the cafeteria? And if you want more billionaire romance, more second chance love stories, more tales of women who refuse to give up, hit that notification bell so you never miss when I drop the next story. Thank you so much for being here, for investing your time and heart into Thorn and Caspian's journey. And remember, you deserve a love story this epic too. Until next time, keep believing in happily ever afters.